Hawk ruled the streets of Liverpool with fear and precision, but it was Vex, the shadow behind his empire, who turned quiet villages into playgrounds of addiction. Then there was Echo, the lieutenant who questioned everything, and Rust, the teenager, whose rebellion would ignite a chain of violence no one saw coming. This is the story of how power, betrayal and desperation collided in Ashbourne, exposing the dark underworld of County-Lines crime. Ashbourne had always been a village where life moved at a gentle, predictable pace. The narrow streets echoed with the sound of footsteps on cobblestones, the occasional bark of a dog, and the quiet laughter of children playing in the late afternoon sun. The village shop closed by 6, the pub shut its doors at 9, and the nights were filled not with sirens but with the soft hum of cicadas. For generations Ashbourne had been a place where everyone knew each other's names, a place where secrets were rare and troubles were minor. That fragile tranquility, however, was about to be shattered by an arrival from the city, a figure who carried danger like a shadow. Marlon Fletcher, known in the criminal underworld as Hawk, appeared suddenly. He was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a quiet confidence that drew attention without effort. His eyes were sharp, calculating, always scanning the surroundings, as if measuring the vulnerabilities of everyone he passed. He rented a small flat on the edge of town, but he never lingered inside for long. Hawk preferred the streets, observing, planning and mapping the village in a way no outsider should. His arrival went almost unnoticed at first. Villagers assumed he was just another city commuter, looking for cheaper rent. But beneath his calm exterior, Hawk was a predator, and Ashbourne was his newest hunting ground. Hawk did not operate alone. He arrived with a small, tightly knit network of couriers, each trained to move through towns silently, like ghosts, delivering drugs to unsuspecting residents. Their methods were precise and efficient, leaving little trace of their presence while ensuring maximum disruption. Ashbourne, with its lack of surveillance, close-knit social fabric, and young population, was the perfect target. Within days the village began to change. Subtle shifts went unnoticed at first. Strangers loitering near pubs, teenagers acting nervously, small thefts that were quickly dismissed as minor incidents. By the end of the week, the signs became harder to ignore. Packages were being delivered and picked up in alleyways, and whispers of debts and odd errands began circulating among the locals. The drugs themselves were not just products, they were tools of control. Hawk's network flooded the village with substances that created dependency quickly. Unlike the slow, occasional experimentation typical of rural towns, the flow was constant, aggressive and manipulative. Hawk and his couriers had perfected the psychology of addiction: lure the vulnerable, trap them in debt, and turn fear into obedience. Local teenagers, struggling with boredom or personal troubles, became the ideal candidates for his schemes. The promise of easy money, freedom, and status hid the chains that were being quietly fastened around them. One of Hawk's first moves was to identify potential couriers among the village's youth. He observed them closely, noting patterns, weaknesses, and ambitions. A quiet boy delivering newspapers, a student struggling to pay for college, even a local with a gambling habit, all became potential assets. Hawk's approach was subtle. He didn't coerce outright. Instead, he offered small opportunities, seeming like a helping hand, a way out of everyday struggles. Once the youths were involved, leaving the operation became nearly impossible. Debts were inflated, intimidation was subtle but constant, and the ever-present fear of Hawk's reach ensured compliance. The adults in the village initially missed the signs. Ashbourne's charm had long blinded them to danger. Outsiders were assumed harmless until proven otherwise. When local shopkeepers noticed an unusual number of teenagers loitering near their doors, they dismissed it as minor troublemaking. When petty thefts increased, it was blamed on boredom or mischief. The subtle manipulations of Hawk's network were almost invisible to those who didn't know what to look for. Yet beneath the calm surface, a silent storm was building. Families were beginning to feel the strain. Children were being pulled into shadowy corners of life they could not fully understand, and Ashbourne's once safe streets were slowly being claimed by a ruthless external force. By the end of Hawke's first month in Ashbourne, the village was unrecognizable. The sense of security that had defined daily life was gone, replaced with a tension that villagers could feel but not name. Strangers were watched with suspicion, teenagers became more guarded, and families whispered warnings to one another behind closed doors. Hawke's influence was invisible but total. He had arrived as quietly as a shadow, and by the time anyone realized what was happening, the village was already under his control. Ashbourne had become a node in a network that stretched far beyond its borders. A small, seemingly peaceful town caught in the grip of a predator from Liverpool. Hawke's grip on Ashbourne was only as strong as the people he controlled, and for that he relied entirely on Livia Carmichael, known in the underworld as Vex. Unlike Hawke, whose presence was overt and intimidating, Vex operated in shadows, unseen but felt everywhere. She was sharp, calculating, and ruthless, but what made her dangerous was her ability to make manipulation appear as kindness. She didn't need violence to recruit, she needed trust, and once she had it, control was inevitable. Vex's first step in Ashbourne was observation. She walked the streets for hours, noting the villagers' routines, habits, and vulnerabilities. She studied the students at the local high school, the part-time workers at the corner shops, and even the parents who struggled quietly with their own problems. Her approach was methodical. Every weakness, every small desire, every unspoken frustration became an opportunity. She was a predator in plain sight, offering a hand when someone thought they were merely receiving attention. The teenagers were her primary focus. Ashbourne's youth had been largely sheltered from the dangers of urban gangs, and that made them both naive and appealing. Vex targeted those who were already struggling, kids whose parents were absent, students who felt invisible, young adults trying to make ends meet. She offered them work, small amounts of money for courier tasks, and the illusion of independence. It seemed innocent at first. Deliver a package here, pick one up there, but the charm of quick cash and newfound status masked a deeper trap. Once a teen was entangled, it became nearly impossible to step away. The debts, both real and imagined, were designed to bind them to the gang, and fear was always lurking just beneath the surface. But Vex's talent wasn't just in recruitment. It was in control. She understood psychology and used it to manipulate emotions, exploiting loyalty, fear, and greed. If a courier hesitated, she would offer encouragement one day, and intimidation the next. Every interaction was carefully measured. Her presence was a constant reminder of who held the power, even when she wasn't physically there. Couriers feared disappointing her more than anyone else, because they knew that failure meant consequences, and Vex never failed to deliver them. Vex's reach extended beyond Ashbourne. She orchestrated deliveries to nearby villages, ensuring the gang's influence spread like a slow-moving storm. Each new town became another node in the network, and with every successful recruitment, the gang grew stronger while the authorities remained blind to the true scale of the operation. Vex had created a system where fear, addiction, and debt intertwined seamlessly, leaving communities dependent on drugs while couriers were trapped in cycles of servitude. Despite the careful planning, cracks began to show, though only to those with eyes to see. A few teenagers questioned the morality of their actions, parents grew increasingly suspicious, and minor errors in communication occasionally exposed the network's operations. Yet Vex adapted quickly. Every mistake was anticipated, every risk calculated. She was both a shield and a weapon for Hawke, ensuring that his influence remained untouchable while also making the network resilient to disruption. By the end of Vex's first month of recruitment, Ashbourne was no longer a simple, quiet village. It had become a web of manipulation, fear, and dependency, with teenagers running errands they did not fully understand, families struggling in silence, and strangers moving through the streets with unseen purpose. Vex had transformed the village into a strategic foothold for Hawke's empire, a place where loyalty could be bought, fear could be exploited, and escape was nearly impossible. And all the while, she moved among the villagers as though she belonged, a silent force turning innocence into chaos, with nothing more than a smile and a careful word. Ashbourne had already begun to change when the first act of overt violence shook the village. a warning that the subtle manipulations and quiet fear were only the beginning. The victim was Callan Bevan, a boy of 17, nicknamed Rust for the fiery streak of red in his hair. Rust had been one of Vex's recruits, a courier who initially saw the work as a way to escape boredom and earn some pocket money. He was clever, cautious, and resourceful, qualities that in most circumstances would have kept him safe, but he underestimated the ruthlessness of Hawk's world. Rust had started to question the morality of his actions. Delivering packages was one thing, but seeing the addiction and despair that came from the drugs he moved had begun to weigh heavily on him. He had watched friends spiral into dependency, families crumble under debt, and local teenagers vanish from school without explanation. For the first time, he realized that the money and excitement were a trap, a chain disguised as opportunity. In a moment of recklessness fueled by guilt, Rust tried to escape the gang's grasp, thinking he could slip away unnoticed. He was wrong. Hawk's network was built not only on fear but on meticulous surveillance. Couriers who tried to leave were marked immediately, their movements traced through digital channels, local informants, and relentless observation. Rust's disappearance did not go unnoticed, and Hawk, furious at this betrayal, decided to make an example of him. One evening, Rust was found battered and bruised near the riverbank on the outskirts of Ashbourne, left where anyone passing could see him. The warning was clear: no one crossed the gang, and lived unscathed. The impact on the village was immediate and profound. Families whispered warnings behind closed doors, parents pulled their children from the streets, and neighbors began to watch each other with suspicion. The veneer of calm that had existed before Hawk and Vex's arrival vanished overnight. Rust's attack was more than violence. It was a willing participants. Even those who wanted to resist found themselves caught in a SF they could not understand, where one wrong move could bring harm to themselves or their loved ones. Hawk's strategy was clear: crush resistance quickly and efficiently, and the rest would fall in line. Despite the terror, some villagers began to notice patterns. Certain strangers appeared regularly, packages changed hands at the same time each day, and the same young faces were repeatedly seen in suspicious circumstances. Local teachers and shopkeepers began documenting details, small acts of resistance forming in silence. These observations, though minor on their own, would later prove crucial in unraveling the network. The psychological impact of Rust's attack lingered. The teenagers who had been couriers felt the weight of guilt and fear simultaneously. Families became hyper-vigilant, parents questioning every interaction, every new friend, and every unexplained absence. The village had entered a new phase, one in which control and submission were no longer abstract concepts but daily realities enforced by Hawk's ruthless oversight. Even as Hawk consolidated his power, the first signs of vulnerability emerged. Rust's attempt to escape had revealed flaws in the network, gaps in surveillance, moments of human error, and opportunities for authorities to intervene. These weaknesses would later become pivotal, though at this stage, the villagers could only sense them as shadows behind the fear. The realization that a single act of defiance could trigger brutal retaliation left the village paralyzed. A reminder that in Hawk's world, loyalty was enforced not with promises, but with pain. By the time the dust settled around Rust's attack, Ashbourne was irrevocably altered. The quiet streets no longer felt safe, teenagers whispered in fear, and families carried the invisible scars of control. Hawk's dominance was cemented through intimidation, and the true cost of his empire was becoming painfully visible. The village, once untouched by the violence of city gangs, had been thrust into a world of brutality and addiction, a stark warning of what happened when predators from Liverpool extended their reach into rural England. Even as Hawk's grip over Ashbourne and surrounding towns seemed unshakable, cracks were beginning to form within his own ranks. Tamsin Wren, known to the gang as Echo, had been one of Hawk's most trusted lieutenants. Quiet, precise, and utterly loyal, or so it seemed, Echo had followed orders without question for months, overseeing deliveries, monitoring couriers, and enforcing Hawk's strict rules. But unlike Hawk and Vex, she had begun to see the human cost of their operation. Faces she had once viewed as numbers or potential recruits now haunted her. She saw families destroyed by addiction, teenagers enslaved by debt, and entire communities manipulated for profit. The weight of what they were doing became unbearable, and she began to question her place in it all. Echo's disillusionment did not manifest overnight. At first, it was small acts of hesitation, a package delivered late, a question raised about a courier's well-being, a minor error in the records. Hawk noticed these anomalies, but Echo was careful, masking her doubts behind routine diligence. She realized that any hint of defiance could be fatal, so she moved with the caution of someone navigating a minefield. Yet each day her conscience grew louder, and the invisible chains of guilt tightened around her, forcing her to act if she wanted to survive her own morality. Her decision to betray Hawk was not made lightly. Echo understood the stakes. Hawk's retaliation was brutal, swift, and unrelenting. One wrong move could result in death, and the gang had already demonstrated their willingness to eliminate anyone who disobeyed. To succeed, Echo had to be meticulous, using her position of trust to gather information without raising suspicion. She began compiling evidence of the gang's operations, delivery routes, courier identities, transaction records, and the digital footprints of their communications. Every piece of intelligence was carefully concealed, stored in ways that Hawk and Vex could not detect. While Echo worked in silence, the gang's internal tensions began to escalate. Rival criminal factions from Manchester had heard rumors of Hawk's lucrative operations in rural towns, and were attempting to encroach on his territory. Minor skirmishes erupted on the edges of Ashbourne. Disputes over territory, stolen shipments, and fights between couriers. Hawk's paranoia grew with each incident. He began scrutinizing his own lieutenants more closely, eliminating anyone he suspected of disloyalty. The climate within the gang shifted from controlled fear to tense suspicion, creating opportunities for mistakes that Echo could exploit. Echo's strategy was subtle but effective. She orchestrated small disruptions in delivery schedules, creating minor delays that attracted the attention of local authorities. These irregularities were carefully calculated, enough to arouse suspicion, but not enough to endanger the couriers. She also fed anonymized tips to police, pointing them towards suspicious activities without revealing herself. Slowly, a picture of Hawk's sprawling network began to emerge outside the gang, one that authorities had been blind to until then. Despite her efforts, Echo was constantly aware that discovery would mean death. Every interaction with Hawk and Vex was a delicate dance. A single misstep could unravel her plan. She moved through meetings, deliveries, and surveillance checks with calculated precision, always maintaining the illusion of loyalty. Even as Hawk's paranoia deepened, Echo became an essential part of the gang's operation, which ironically protected her. He trusted her completely, giving her access to information and control, unaware that she was systematically dismantling his empire from within. The tipping point came when a violent clash occurred between Hawk's couriers and rival gang members near the outskirts of Ashbourne. 2 young couriers were killed, and several locals were injured in the chaos. The event sent shockwaves through the village, terrifying residents and exposing cracks in the gang's once unquestioned dominance. Hawk reacted with extreme force, punishing those he believed responsible and further tightening his control over Ashbourne. Yet this very act of brutality created the window Echo needed. The heightened scrutiny on Hawk's side distracted him from the subtle leaks she had engineered, allowing authorities to gain more insight into the network's operation. Echo's betrayal was a turning point. The first signs of weakness in Hawk's otherwise flawless empire began to surface. Deliveries were intercepted, key couriers were identified, and investigative leads expanded across multiple counties. The balance of power, once absolute, was starting to shift. Echo's courage and careful planning had transformed her from a silent observer into the catalyst for change, setting the stage for the eventual unraveling of Hawk's criminal empire. By the end of this period, Ashbourne was caught between fear and hope. Hawk's ruthlessness was still present, the streets still dangerous, and the villagers still living under the shadow of the gang. Yet Echo's actions had sparked a quiet resistance, a chance for authorities to fight back and for the community to reclaim some control. In the shadows of loyalty, manipulation, and betrayal, the first cracks of reckoning had appeared, foreshadowing a confrontation that would determine the future of the village and the fate of Hawke's empire. The final act of Hawke's reign in Ashbourne began quietly, almost imperceptibly, with the slow accumulation of mistakes and exposure that Echo had orchestrated. The gang's operations, once invisible and flawless, were now under the scrutiny of local authorities, neighboring towns, and even rival criminal factions. Hawke, despite his intelligence and ruthlessness, could not foresee every betrayal, every leak, or every shift in the environment he controlled. The walls he had built around his empire were cracking, and the cracks were spreading faster than he could repair them. It started with small raids. Police officers, armed with evidence Echo had carefully funneled, began targeting the gang's couriers and safe houses. Packages were intercepted, phones seized, and local teenagers questioned. The disruption caused confusion and fear within the gang, undermining their discipline. Hawke, paranoid and angry, demanded loyalty with increasing severity. His punishments became harsher, his commands more erratic. Couriers began making mistakes, not out of disloyalty, but out of fear, panic, and the pressure of constant surveillance. The network that had once seemed untouchable was unraveling, thread by thread. Hawke's frustration reached a boiling point when one of his long-term couriers, a boy named Declan Frost, failed to deliver a crucial shipment to a neighboring town. The shipment had been traced by police and confiscated, leaving Hawke furious and vulnerable. Declan's punishment was severe, but it could not restore the control Hawke had lost. The gang's operations had become too complex, too exposed, and too dependent on individuals who were now aware that loyalty came at the cost of safety. Hawke's arrogance and overconfidence, once his greatest strengths, had become liabilities. Echo, meanwhile, continued to operate within the shadows, orchestrating moves that further destabilized the gang. She authorities with detailed information about Hawke's routines, hideouts, and communications. She subtly encouraged couriers to cooperate when questioned, offering reassurance and guidance without exposing herself. The network began to collapse from within, with couriers abandoning their posts, deliveries failing, and rival factions encroaching on Hawke's territory. Each small victory against the gang amplified the pressure, forcing Hawke into mistakes that further accelerated his downfall. The tipping point came during a coordinated police operation across Ashbourne and surrounding towns. Acting on intelligence provided by Echo, law enforcement surrounded Hawke's central base of operations early one morning. Couriers were arrested before they could react, and key evidence documenting the gang's entire network was seized. Hawke, caught off guard despite his reputation for vigilance, attempted to flee, but the police had anticipated every possible escape route. The empire he had built with meticulous planning crumbled in a matter of hours.